Hi, y'all. Welcome. My name is Adam Strom. I'm here with two really wonderful colleagues. Introduce yourselves, wonderful colleagues.
Hi, I'm Ashley Aluko.
Hi, and I'm Jill Eisenberg from Lee and Low Books.
And I'm from Reimagining Migration. Jill just said she's from Lee and Low. Ashley, where are you from?
New York originally, but currently as our teacher in residence at Reimagining Migration.
Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about just what the session said it was going to be talking about. We're going to talk about creating culturally responsive text to understand migration. And if you don't know what a culturally responsive text set is, Jill's going to explain. So the agenda is this, and we'll play with the order just a bit. So introductions, you've been introduced. I'm going to kick us off by thinking about why should we even teach about migration and give you some frameworks to think about how you might approach it. Jill's going to help us talk about a text set and what to look for in creating one. And she's going to model one that uses Reimagining's learning arc that I'll introduce. And then Ashley will talk about a different sort of text set, not a books text set, a document text set that she's created to teach about the Great Migration. And then we'll wrap it up and wish that we were all in person together so we could have those better conversations in the hallway afterwards. So let me kick this off. First of all, I actually mean this as a question. Why teach about migration anyway? And the problem in a recorded video is we don't get to have this conversation. So let me play with language for a second. And migrate, it's important. Migrate is a verb, right? So migrate simply means to go from one country, one region, or one place. So this is actually something that humans have been doing fundamentally. If you look at actually human beings, how do we have the evidence of the first human beings? The evidence of the first human beings that we have is actually through footprints in the world. And well, footprints in the world are a sign that people have been on the move forever since we first stood up. All of us. This is the through line of the human experience. All of us are descended from people who migrated. And you might stop and say, but wait, my family didn't cross a border. Migrate simply means to move. And so think that larger human history, a story of migration can cross a national border. It can cross a regional border. It can be from apartment to apartment. Because those adjustments, as somebody who's moved from a lot of apartments to a lot of apartments, those adjustments could be pretty awkward too. How do you turn on this shower without the water hitting me in the head, right? So those are all, where is the bedroom anyway? And how do you turn on the stove? Think about how those little experiences of adjustment are both similar and then quite different to some of the more fundamental and maybe longer lasting and with deeper impact stories of migration in the world and in this country. So all of us are descended from people who've migrated. It's fundamental to the history of this country. I would argue that there is no through line history of the United States that isn't actually entirely centered on the story of human movement, whether it's enslaved Africans and the colonial settlers and the indentured servants of the early periods of the United States, to westward expansion, the changing borders of this country and ethnic cleansing of Native communities, whether it's the period of immigration and migration that kind of people classically teach in the 19th century. But that's only one story, right? There's the lure of the United States, right? And then the backlash and the anti-immigrant legislation of the early 20th century. And then in the middle of the 20th century, when there were very deep restrictions against borders, migration still becomes a through line, because who can we trust and who is going to be loyal, right? And the treatment of Japanese Americans becomes a fundamental case study about American identity. In 1965, we redid our immigration laws. And I think we're still reverberating with this history, thinking about how our country has changed demographically and how we're going to learn to live together as a people. And to me, this is why y'all have a job to teach about this stuff. So again, there are common elements to their story, but they're not the same. I'm not saying they're the same. I believe these differences help us better understand ourselves, inequity, our country, and our community. So we've identified some dispositions that we think are really important when you teach about this history. We think it helps young people learn perspective taking, and these are really fundamental academic skills. It helps them inquire about things that they don't know that are different, right? And hopefully doing this with nuance and care instead of relying on stereotypes. It's how do we start to build and communicate and build relationships across difference, right? So my experience is maybe not the same as Jill and Ashley's, but how do we find ways to build and talk about this stuff in a way that allows us to get to a deeper understanding? Part of that is recognizing the power and inequities in our experiences and in the differences in the experiences that we're talking and teaching about. And then ultimately, I mean, look, civic education is finally getting good attention, right? And so how do we help encourage young people to think about their role in creating communities of belonging? Because if human beings are naturally on the move, that means all of us have a responsibility. So we're going to model a learning arc that helps us think about going from our own stories to deeper stories in different time periods that we could explore through literature, to taking action. I'm actually going to suggest that if you want to go and explore our learning arc, which I hope you do, there's a link built into every one of these slides, which we will make available. And so the learning arc has actually got a whole series of questions that can guide inquiry. And I know that Ashley and Jill will go there deeper. So, and our approach to teaching at Reimagining Migration comes by a blend of thinking about our students or school or courses or discipline, then thinking about how does the learning arc intersect with the dispositions that we're trying to teach? How does it intersect with the pedagogy that we think is core to good teaching? And how does it intersect with the resources and lessons that we should be teaching, right? And so Ashley and Jill are going to be talking a lot about resources, right, in these text sets. So before I go, I'll just say one thing about pedagogy. A lot of Reimagining's individual classroom pedagogy is influenced by work from our colleagues at Project Zero, where they've done this great work thinking about thinking routines, really simple teaching structures that can help you reinforce certain ideas. So for all those pieces of the dispositions that we introduced, we have a set of thinking routines designed to take you deeper. So I'm not going to go through every thinking routine, but I want you to see that for all of the ideas, there's a whole set of pedagogical tools that I'm just giving you. Each one of these is linked to the deck. You go find them or you go find them on our website. And now I'm going to shut up and turn this over to my colleague, Jill, because I'm hopefully giving you kind of an understanding of why we think this is important. And here's our framework for teaching about it. So Jill, it's you, lady.
All right. So first step, can you guys see my screen that I'm now sharing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. And hopefully, let's see, we'll just play it real quickly. So thank you, Adam. I mean, I want to emphasize again the fact that this is a recording and we're not all here in the same room together. Please contact us. We'll give our contact information at the end if there's any of these infographics or any of these resources, because we're just going to throw a lot at you guys. And we really want to make sure that you get a chance to really dive into some of these materials, because there's just some wonderful tools that Reimagining Migration has put together, hopefully that we're going to highlight here for you guys as well. So kind of building off of what Adam was talking, now to make sure you guys were able to see the screen change, all the tech. Okay, the first piece I'm going to talk about real briefly is what we actually mean by building a culture responsive text set to understand immigration and migration. You know, when we're thinking about it, it is a lot about what we're already thinking about culture responsive collections already. You know, the first thing we're thinking about, and I'm sitting here in a place of looking at children's literature, whether it's for elementary school, middle school, or high school, and then you're also going to be thinking about how is this going to align with primary source documents and different archives that you're going to be sharing with students. But first and foremost, when you're looking through the lens of immigration and migration, texts that are going to engage your students, what is really going to transform them? It's going to make them sit up and listen and be excited to be talking about this subject matter. As you're building this text set, and we're going to go into more details of what those steps are and what to be thinking about is, you know, thinking about really pulling to the center of the story varying demographic and social identity markers, looking at race, looking at geography, looking at family configuration, who's being represented in the stories we're telling about immigration and migration. oftentimes when we're looking at collections, when a surface beginning spot could either be like, we're looking at Ellis Island, or immigration in modern day is only Latinx immigration from the Mexico into the US country. That's just okay, one sub story for one part of a community, but how can we make sure that we're really talking about what immigration migration looks like globally, as well as within the US and across different time periods? As you're pulling together books, again, making sure, thinking about what the reading levels are, your students who are going to be coming to you, particularly with a year of lost learning, how you can meet students both at, above, and below the grade levels. And this is a big piece too we talk about, is calling out misrepresentations and stereotypes. If you have books that are contributing to misunderstandings around immigration, migration, or about the communities or people that the story is about, it is time to either remove that book from the collection, or think about, if that is a core text, for example, that you're required to use, how can it be done through an adult instructional support, so that you can make sure that you do address the misrepresentations and stereotypes, and allow students to grapple that with adult support. As well as making sure that then you're checking in on any trauma or triggering experiences that they could experience. Again, also, one of the pieces in terms of talking about the reading levels, where does immigration, migration, the types of story, are you only seeing realistic fiction? Or are you only seeing historical fiction? What nonfiction exists out there? What poetry exists out there that can really shine light on the experiences of immigration and migration across periods of history? This is another piece too, in terms of looking for opportunities for local and global learning. This is a unique opportunity to not make sure that even when you are zooming in on one time period, that you put it in a bigger context for students to understand that this is, as Adam mentioned, a through line through the human story, the human history, and that it wasn't just this one-off event. And again, oftentimes as we're going to take a look at some of the curriculum, making sure that students have that sense of there are many different time periods, many different intersections for communities and cultures that we're interacting, and how that's represented in the books. If there's a lot of tools that we can think of, this set right here, if you can screenshot it, or we'll make sure to get it to you guys afterwards, would be these 4 links can really help you take a look at what books you already have, either in your core curriculum, either in the social studies curriculum you're using, the mentor text, the shared interactive reading text, or books that you're going to make available to students in small group or independent study or classroom libraries. But these tools at a curriculum level, at a book level, and at an individual title level, you can take a look at both the accuracy and the cultural responsiveness, as well as looking at the rigor and text complexity, and adding in, with Adam's reimagining migration learning arc framework, of where immigration and migration fit. These tools are meant to not say, hey, get rid of all the books and start over, but really, let's look at what strengths your collections already have in immigration and migration, and then where can it be further bolstered, or where can you fill in the gaps that you do find. This is just a really quick mini example of, if I were building a text set, or I were building my classroom library shelf, and looking at where can immigration, migration really be pulled out. You are going to want to have stories that showcase and connections that students can relate to with a particular type of immigration or period or group of people, similarities and differences. What do we have in common? And there's going to be stories where the immigration and migration will be just a part of the background of the story. It won't be front and center to the whole point of the story. And that is going to be a time when maybe you are going to want stories like that. Then there will be times for stories where you're going to specifically want to call it out, talk about, a period of time that's happening, a community, and what they were experiencing, what that refugee experience was, what that immigration experience was, and then talking about also putting it in historical context. And then not leaving it just there of in the historical place, because sometimes recognizing that contemporary immigration, migration are happening, but also showcasing joy in immigrant communities, in migration, as much as it can be. There can be a lot of pain, there can be a lot of trauma, there can be a lot of complex narratives for sure, and events that are happening, but also making sure that we're showing, particularly people of color experiencing joy, experiencing love and happiness and joy with their families and in their communities. And so thinking about, what does this collection that we're presenting to students really help them see the full experience, or as much as we can, through children's literature of different groups. But if
Thank
this
you
was
for
my
saying
mini,
joy.
yeah, for sure. That we don't do enough. And after I say, I mean, that's something we've been trying to talk about a lot more at Lee and Low recently. And that's, it's been unbelievable to see just the response of how hungry I think we all are for that, for ourselves, for our students, now more than ever. And looking at this collection here, like if this was my mini library, my text set, pulling out like, what am I doing well? If I use those tools, and I'll put those up again, okay, I've got some great examples of global communities. I've got examples of books written fully by BIPOC authors and illustrators. I've got a range of reading levels. I've got some genres, a range of genres. Okay, so this is doing pretty well. But if you were to look at this, and say, okay, where around immigration and migration am I not doing well? What could I enhance further? Perhaps, I would say I might need a few more historical periods. I don't have enough contemporary examples of of South Asian or East Asian immigration to the United States, or maybe there are regions of the country that are not featured here. And thinking about how can I, all right, looking at these tools, I'll put up again, how can I use these to take a look at what I do have going well and where I can go from there to really make sure that I'm providing just the fullest story we can through immigration migration using children's literature. We actually work together with the Reimagining Migration team to kind of talk about what are some of the questions we could be thinking about as you're building a migration text. So that column is on the right end, thinking about, as we'd mentioned, different formats and genres, looking about, what are the contributions migration and migrants have had to the United States? So where can that be great for, that could be a wonderful place to do biographies and nonfiction. Do you have a range of migrant experiences and stories within a community? That's a really, really big one. If you find that all of your stories about, as I mentioned, let's say, a Latino community, which is again a very broad and almost not as useful umbrella term, are all of the stories just talking about immigration? What does that mean, before and after? How can you make sure that we're providing a more nuanced and complex and rich stories, multiple stories to that you're not just telling one story by the few books that you have in your classroom? And so we wanted to make a model. This was not meant to be, this is the only way to align children's literature to the learning arc framework, but to provide educators an opportunity to see, okay, taking, contemporary children's books written in the last, 50 years, how could we map them out to the learning framework? Where do the kids' books, as you dive into the library, your school library, your public library, which section of the framework do you feel most comfortable teaching students? Is it the understanding migration part? Is it the turning to action piece? And where can you focus there? This can definitely, this thought process that we have can be used for, that we did it for the secondary grades. I'm just showing the elementary one here, but this can be done fully in Spanish or fully in Hmong, looking at the children's books in the population that you are serving. And here, we try to align it also taking a look at the text complexity required at those grade levels, but trying to see that the learning arc framework is a wonderful tool to really help build out that text set around migration and immigration. So again, these were the questions that we walked ourselves through to build that text set to kind of map our books to. And even for us, actually, it was a really fascinating learning process for Lee and Low to kind of look at our own catalog, right? Like that's a giant library for us, and to think about what part of immigration and migration and those stories are we doing well, and where do we need to continue to seek out authors and illustrators to help us tell even more stories for young people. As I kind of wrap up hand over the mic to Ashley. This is really meant to, all of these tools and what we're talking about today is to supplement and complement the programs that you guys are working with, the curriculum that you are. We know that you're not in a curriculum vacuum. You either have a program or, the curriculum that your school has made or district has made, or that is coming from a curriculum creator nationwide. But how can you use the tools that we're presenting today to really think about, how you can pair with the core text you may be required with to add that extra lens around migration and immigration, to provide additional new perspectives that for underrepresented or historically misrepresented or excluded voices and viewpoints into your ELA and social studies curriculum. One example I wanted to give was looking at New York. I'm not, just calling out New York, but they have some resources that I think we could actually look at for any district that you are in and teaching in across the country. Back in 2019 in December, a group of parents and educators put together a report looking at the lack of representation in authors and illustrators in the curriculum that was selected by the New York City DOE. And what was fascinating about this is, first of all, this lens was only around looking at race and ethnicity. So if we were to think about other ways that our communities and our districts are diverse, and what makes each of them unique. New York, for example, there's 800 languages spoken in New York and among our students. So this is just one aspect of our students' identities that they were trying to capture, but still it was telling an important story of the curriculum that we were bringing into our districts and schools need to do more to reflect the communities that they're in both, in terms of both historical and contemporary migration, immigration right here in the home base. If whatever district you are in, I very much encourage you to seek out what either your district or state has as a portal to look at what your approved curriculum is and really take a look at the text. For example, New York City has their platforms called We Teach New York City, and you can see all of the approved curriculum for that district. And with it, you can see what units and themes are being used across grade levels. Why is that important? Well, one of the areas that I live, when we think about how can you start building a text set around migration, immigration that's culturally responsive, is thinking about how you can map it to your curriculum. So this is a pretend curriculum. This one is just one that we made as the example here, but you'll see a lot of themes that will be popular or topics that are popular in a lot of social studies and ELA programs around the country. And here, so this is our pretend K-4 social studies curriculum. And, it can feel very overwhelming as a teacher or as an administrator of like where to even begin to put immigration or migration. And it can be one thing like, oh, great, we have one unit 4 in grade 3, we get to talk about immigration. It's done. And that is very much just the easy way out in terms of just waiting for one unit to, and then it can feel the overwhelming pressure to have everything speak in that unit for that age group. But looking at broadly across where your kids are going to go from K-4 to K-5, looking at here, where can immigration or migration be tied in or called out more that is present in almost every unit here. Some of them are going to lend themselves to more easily discussion to find the children's literature or fiction and nonfiction around me and my family and our community and my school, and others will be more challenging or will have be more difficult to navigate. And so that's where we definitely encourage you to, work with colleagues, seek out, the tools that are on reimagining migration, as well as, talk to public librarians. They are the experts and there for you of if there are certain units here that you're like, hey, we all have to teach, American Revolution or World War I and Great Depression. Work with them on, hey, these are the units, but where can we pull out immigration and migration because that's maybe lacking in your own library in your classroom. So real finally, one thing I love to showcase is just, the big push here is go to your public librarians. At the end of the day, I never want, people to feel that they have to be Googling this by themselves, but just like the turkey butterball hotline that you can call the day of Thanksgiving for any help with your turkey questions, the Penguin Random House, another book publisher, tend to do that for Christmas to offer that support for gift buying back in 2018. I included the map at the bottom for mapdeveloper.com of all of the public libraries, whether it's like a mobile van, a bus, anything, so that you can see that, there are very big book deserts here in the United States, but there are resources, virtual and in person, through public libraries to help you build that collection of immigration and migration, that you are not alone. And I encourage you to take a look. And to start with too, with librarians working with what are the best of the best books out there, immigration and migration. There is not one kids book award out there that's like, this book teaches immigration or migration. But the American Library Association has some unbelievable books and collections around award-winning books across communities. And you will see immigration and migration tied throughout these children's book awards, whether it's for social studies, whether it's for nonfiction, whether it's for talking specifically about showcasing and centering stories around disabilities, the Latinx community, African-American and Black history and culture, and people, like all of these different awards out there. Start with them in terms of helping find the best of the best immigration and migration stories available to you, because you have to be strategic with what you put in front of your kids, and you can know that a group like the American Library Association is seeking to make sure and hold to account the accuracy, the honesty, the representation for students today. I can speak for contemporary awards, cannot speak for super past winners. And then finally, before I hand over the mic to Ashley, a few more resources to really take a look at how, who are other groups doing and thinking about where children's literature can fit to support building a text set around immigration and migration. Those are some websites. Here are some blogs. The discussions are amazing. And again, you might not think necessarily where immigration, migration intersects with disabilities or sexual orientation and gender, but those are happening. And those are fantastic ways to see what is out there and available to your students, and also to see what support is, in terms of the community of how you can go about teaching it. So the book isn't just thrown into your classroom and you're scrambling to figure out where it really fits. Lean on a lot of the rich discussion happening here. So I will now turn the mic and screen over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was just a wealth of just really great information. It felt like kind of like a tiny desk. Like dopeness on literature, and I'm so glad that we got to do that together. Jill gave you an amazing overview of what it looks like to do this with a book set, and the way that I'm thinking about this is I've been tasked with, and it's not a task, it's actually a privilege and a great honor to be able to think about the notion of the Great Migration. And what does that look like to overlay the learning arc from reimagining migration with the Great Migration, and particularly at least the first part of it, right? Because often when we think about the Great Migration, like, Jacob Lawrence comes to mind, and you see all these beautiful artwork of people of color, like leaving one place and going into another, and leaving the South and coming up North. But the narrative of the Great Migration is kind of giving you, I think, Adam, it's giving all 7 books of Harry Potter, right? Like the Great Migration is not from 1910 to 1921 or 1930, as we like to talk about it, but it's actually, 7 books in. It's 1910 through the 1970s, right? And it beautifully overlays on this arc actually twice, but for the purposes of what we're going to talk through right now, we're just going to look at that first iteration of that overlay of the arc. And one of the things that I found when I was looking at this is the whole narrative of the Great Migration speaks to the whole narrative of the learning arc. So when I was thinking about how I begin to think through this process and how do I begin to think about how I overlay this, I started thinking about like, well, how do I get out of the way and allow those who went through this experience to tell their own stories? So what are the primary sources that I can leverage, or what historians who have dedicated their life to making sure that the voices of the past don't get muffled by the perspectives of the present? get to shine brightly, right? So this was for me another opportunity to think about what is a text that look like, not necessarily beautifully bound in a book, but necessarily through the lens of like, how are students getting access to literature around the past that allows the perspectives of the past to be centered. So when I thought about the Great Migration and I thought about the journey of the Ark, right? For moving stories, like there's nothing better than the richness of the personal narratives and the letters that people wrote home. And I want us to just pause for a second and recognize that when you leave home now, right, you leave home in a world where you have cars and planes and trains. And if really necessary, right, like it may not be the easiest thing in the world, but it's hard to imagine a world where like logistically you can't get home within 2 to 3 days if something happens, right? In 25 hours, I could be in the Maldives. Don't ask me how I know that exactly. Just know that the pandemic has required me to think about how long it would take me to get to the Maldives. So I know that within 25 hours, I could be in the Maldives if I needed to be, right? But these personal narratives that are written in 1910 and 1911, they're written by people who don't know if they'll ever come back, who don't know if they'll ever see their family members again. So they're writing home in some ways to justify that journey. Like, I may never see you again, but I need you to know I'm okay, right? So these moving stories are really rich with narratives of hope, of loss, of fear, of excitement, right? And understanding the journey, right? Like understanding the journey is talking about like that life before migration. Why is the South simultaneously the roots of home, but the place you can't wait to go from, right? For many of us who've had the privilege of going to college, right? It's that second half of senior year that like, I'm itching to go, like this doesn't fit me anymore. And understanding the push and pull factors of migration, right? Like why were people so perfectly primed in the 19 teens to really just have options? Like what coordinated factors allowed for African Americans to be sick of the South and have options to go somewhere else, right? So that's the life before migration. The journey, like Adam, if you could wave the Jacob Lawrence one more time, right? The artifacts of the journey, again, right? Like all of the artwork, all of the beauty, all of the understandings of like, or even just looking at the images of the like the tickets, right? And the pews and people leaving, right? Artifacts of the journey, they were made in real time. Like this artwork is not 50 or 60 years later. This artwork is in the moment and shortly after. This artwork is honoring, like this may not have been my story, but it was my mom's, right? And then that adjustment, right? You've moved, you've changed, you've gotten to this new place, right? To harken back to something that Adam said, right? Like your footsteps are in new soil. And for some people, these have been the dreams that you've had for like years, right? Like these are echoes of like your grandparents' dreams. But what happens when like it's you know, not to pull on Langston Hughes a little too much, but like what happens when it's a little bit of a dream deferred, right? Like that new soil has a lot of the same bitterness of the old tensions, right? And more importantly, what happens when like that little bubble of the moment that you were in gets burst by the reality of the larger context of the world, right? Like the end of World War I, right? Tensions, that summer of 1919, right? Where dreams start looking a little nightmarish. And then how do you take that pain and turn it into purpose? Well, they turned it into action, right? It's not an accident that after the summer of 1919, you have the new Negro movement, you have Alain Locke talking actively about like, we can't be the people we were before. And you have people like Claude McKay writing poems like If We Must Die, right? So it is a beautiful overlay, a beautiful parallel of the arc. So I wanted to make sure that I was doing the lived experience of those who came before me justice when I was picking text. And that meant being really, really intentional about centering their own words and their own stories. So for me, it was what images could tell the story, because literacy isn't always just words, sometimes it's visual. So I looked for maps that helped us understand one of my favorite things. If you know anything about me, and y'all don't, but you will now, you know that I absolutely love Kendrick Lamar. And one of the things that was really interesting when you like look at his lyrics, because I think lyrics are a perfect place for analysis if you're not quite into poetry yet. Like it's the doorway that opens the door. He talks a lot about how his parents were from Chicago, right? And if you trace that a little bit further back, they are from Chicago 2 generations after their ancestors have moved from the South, right? So it is an amazing continuation of a story of the Great Migration and the narrative of like, well, when we're not happy, we move, right? And that's one of the push factors, right, that you see in this map of how we get big cities that have larger sections of African Americans. It's not an accident that we tend to live in certain areas, and all of that is rooted out of the railroad routes coming out of the 1910s. And then, you know, the opportunities that allowed for you to be there, right? So what you're seeing on your screen is literally an ad that was posted December 1st, 1917, that was naming that, like, if you really, really wanted to aid in the war effort, if you wanted to be a man of your country, well, come up north and come help make factory goods, right? So you have this push out of the South for many racial and economic reasons, and this pull from the North of all the promises of factory jobs and economic opportunities that just didn't exist before, right? And that was great, but you know, unfortunately, for those who had moved and who were able to take on these jobs and who were able to really, really engage in the war effort, wars end. And when the war ends, people are coming home expecting to pick back up where their lives left off and the jobs that the new migrants have now filled. And that creates a level of racial tension and frustration that led to a lot of economic strife and struggles and adjustment. And there is no bigger adjustment than people having to deal with like leaving a place, right? Leaving their home, as the military men would tell you, they left their home one way and they came home years later and they found different races, different identities, and different people in the beds, in the jobs, in the places that they had left behind, and having to negotiate what home means now for the group that thought that this home would be a promised land for them, and for those who came home expecting that home to be exactly the way they left it. And a lot of that resulted in tension that led to that exact primary source front cover page from August 2nd, 1919, that talks about Chicago erupting, like literally and physically erupting into violence that lost the lives of over 1,000 Black families over literally an invisible line in the water, right? But that invisible line was tied to very visible tensions that had spilled over after months of an inability to adjust to one another.
A great way of reminding us that borders, right? They exist sometimes on a map.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're these imaginary lines and they all have consequences.
Yeah. And for me, like, I've known this story, but I didn't want to name that story. I wanted the primary source to name it, right? So riots sweep Chicago, right? Ghastly deed of rates riots told, right? Just very clear, right? Like, to get top billing in a paper in 1919 makes it very, very clear. Like, this is kind of like that ticker banner on CNN. Like, it's very clear like how important and impactful this was. And I wanted to make sure that the sources themselves would speak. And I want to be clear that, like, while I spent time thinking intentionally about Chicago's story, it's not just Chicago, right? This happens across the United States. And I wanted to make sure that we were able to see that it happens across the United States, so much so that 1919 gets called the Red Summer. And because primary sources are really, really impactful, but they're not the totality of the experience, especially because if we're honest, in 1919, African Americans were not the authority on themselves. They were not allowed to be the authority on themselves. So often they could not necessarily always write down their facts as facts. So we have to be able to read against the grain and engage in music and poetry and art, in the narratives that they left behind that to some may be called fiction, but they were the only ways that they could leave their stories behind. And then in Claude McKay's If We Must Die, right, written in the summer of 1919, he is beginning to craft a narrative that we know in the New Negro movement, where he ends with saying like, well, what thought before us lies the open grave, like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back, right? No longer willing to take things exactly as they are, right? Like we left the South with the hopes that we would no longer have to be in situations where we would have to bend and bow and break. And this is kind of the beginnings of that resistance that begins to become a tapestry of artwork, of identity, of redefining who they are, right? And it's not an accident that directly after that, we get the Harlem Renaissance. And as much as I would like to play this video for you, I do want to make sure that we have enough time. It is a video that centers in on the beauty, the art, the clothing, the resources, the thought process on migration, and how they channeled all of this newness to also mean like, if I'm in a new space with a new job and a new thought process, that also means that I get to decide that I want to be a new me. And what does that look like? And who gets to decide that for me but me, right? It's not an accident that the Harlem Renaissance comes directly after the first wave of the Great Migration. And when I was thinking about how to choose sources, I thought about the intentionality of our reading levels, right? How do I mix like deep historical primary sources with visuals that help get the idea across? How do I ensure that if someone is struggling with reading, the video that I'm not showing in this moment can kind of encapsulate what you might have missed? How do I ensure that we're not just looking at like factual information, but also an expression of voices in the time with poetry, right? I don't know if I necessarily hit everything that would have rounded out this text set. Looking at this right now and thinking about this right now, there are amazing articles. There's an amazing one right now on NPR that talks about the reverse migration that's happening right now with African Americans leaving cities in droves and returning to the South, and allowing that to be kind of a culminating point to think about like, well, what were the push and pull factors now, right? If people are like moving their feet and moving to new soil, what caused them to move then? What's causing people to move now, right? So those would be the ways that I'd be thinking intentionally about a text set. It doesn't necessarily always have to be directly in a book, but it still requires that same level of intentionality. It still requires that same level of honoring the truths of the individuals who came before us and giving them the space to tell their own narratives as much as humanly possible, especially when they were choosing to make big decisions like leave a home they've always known to create a home somewhere else. Adam, I don't know if you're talking.
I'm muted. That's excellent. How many of you have ever done that in the last 3 months? So how many of you do it every day? Sorry about that. What I was saying is what I really liked about what Ashley did is Ashley put together this text set that's a reminder, right? That part of when we're thinking about text is multimedia, text is visual, text is poetry, text is primary sources, text is nonfiction, text is fiction, right? And let's think broadly. Jill was, I think, doing that as well. But I think it's really good modeling that, you know, sometimes this is about a selection of a whole book and sometimes it's a shorter piece. What I'm hoping is in this session, and then I'll be quiet and let Ashley and Jill take final thoughts, is I'm hoping that reimagining's my approach, the learning arc, with kind of some tied in, here are the kind of dispositions we're working towards, can help you make smart decisions. Because it's one thing to think about text, but how does this capture kind of your larger content goals as well as your academic goals? So that's what I want to say. And then you can find anything that I mentioned on our website and hopefully on lots of others. So So thank you all for paying attention. Jill, Ashley, other things y'all want to say?
Oh, actually, I'm just gonna make sure we have our the slide just so people can reach us if they want, because I know we shared a lot. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think to be able to hit home here that when we talk about building a tech set of being as creative to what you have access to, as well as thinking, what is going to get your kids and students to sit up and be excited about what they're reading. And I mean, as Ashley showed in terms of being able to show, in the news articles and the videos, the footage, if and not only can go back, for 120, 150 years, but to have those kinds of video footage to really get students to understand what the journey of that immigration and migration was, both before families and people and communities left to where they were going, and to be able to see that. And then how, also children's literature can fit in with that. How can it break down some really complex subject matter? How can you take, really traumatic materials too, and find, authors and illustrators who can find ways to make it to give kids the language to have those discussions in the classroom, and to be thinking about where this fits into the larger part of your curriculum.
I just, I would just really implore us to think about the fact that like we have an amazing opportunity to think intentionally about how do we make whatever the content is, whether it's historical, which is what I love, or contemporary, an opportunity for students to really think about their own lived experience, to find universality, but also find specific moments of difference between their own experiences and those either on the page or on the screen or in their ears, and to help make meaning of like their unique world, their unique existence amongst a
Yeah.
broader, diverse, ever interdependent world that needs them to be able to navigate not only their experience, but a multitude of others, right? And we want to equip them for a world that wants them to feel safe and secure and to be seen, but also wants them to be able to acknowledge people who have different experiences than them. And how can we be supporters and co-conspirators in their cultural competence, right? That's always the goal. And that's something that I want to make sure that like, if there are any questions about that, like there's definitely space for any of us to follow up with you on it.
Well, I love that. I just want to say one thing is I was going to shut up and I can't. Well, it's an honor to present with Jill and Ashley because I learned something. And, one of the things I think about, the reason that so many of us have gone into education is I think we like learning and we like being engaged. So I think the thing that I hear Ashley and Jill saying the most beyond here's how to create something, it's actually here's how to create something so you can empower your students. So then we can learn from them.
Yeah.
Right? That's the full cycle. So thank you all so much. Ashley and Jill, y'all are like amazing. So please be in touch, y'all. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.